Thank you very much, Regina. Thank you very much, Liam. It's a great pleasure, an honor for me to be back here. Pretty to be back in this room. This used to be, maybe some of you, my vintage might remember when this was LG1 or LG2, I think it was called, and it was where DramSoc, the Drama Society, operated here. I never acted, but I did. I spent a lot of my life as a theatre critic, and the first book I wrote was about Tom Murphy. And the first Tom Murphy play I saw was right here, the Morning After Optimism, a wonderful production of it. So it's very meaningful and moving for me to be back here, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity. You might wonder why I'm taking up this lovely invitation in the context of the American Revolution to talk about a figure who I would guess most of you have never heard of. Certainly most people in Ireland haven't. And indeed, most people in America have never heard of either. But there's a very specific reason why I do want to talk about this extraordinary story. And it's to do with multiculturalism, really. There's a narrative now that, you know, that there's Ireland and then there's multiculturalism, and that Ireland is now having to deal with multiculturalism in ways that Irish people never had to do before. And I hope by the end of the next 3 hours or so of this lecture that you will, you'll maybe agree with me that there's nothing new about Irish people operating in staggeringly multicultural contexts. And the specific context I would like to talk about tonight is, as Liam said, this is, we're dealing with a period, I will talk about the American Revolution at the end, but it's really the period that creates the American Revolution. So the crucible of the United States is not 1776. It's the struggle for domination of North America between France and Britain. One of the great ironies is that there was no possibility that the United States would have been formed in the 1770s if Britain had not defeated France on the continent. Because there was no way that a Protestant, largely British people were going to break away from the mother ship while you had a very active and aggressive Catholic power contesting the same territory. So it is one of the great ironies of history is that the British triumph in what they call the 7 Years' War, but the Americans call the French and Indian War, is actually what creates the circumstances in which America can declare independence, and Britain loses at least part of its North American empire, of course not Canada. So I'd like to maybe start with three anomalies, three rather odd fragments of this history. One is, so one of the great sources for anybody writing about the American Revolution or the revolutionary period are the letters between John Adams, one of the major revolutionary figures, the big Boston politician and revolutionary, to his wife Abigail. You know, these are great letters, and they're sort of an endless source. But this is a little bit that's very seldom commented on. So this is after the Revolutionary War has begun. This is Adams writing to Abigail, August 1777. And he says, in the northern department, they begin to fight. The family of Johnson, the black part of it, as well as the white, are pretty well thinned rascals. They deserve extermination. And two things leap out at you here. I mean, one is the vehemence, right? You know, exterminate these people. Right? And the second thing that's interesting is he talks about a family which is black and white. Right? What does he mean by this? He expects Abigail to already understand this. He never explains this reference in the letter, right? So these are notorious people from the point of view of the American revolutionaries, and they're seen as racially mixed, which is part of the justification for their coming extermination. So I'll come back and try and explain what might be going on there. A second sort of odd shard of this history are these Canadian postage stamps. And they feature a woman who actually has 3 different names: Molly Brandt, Konwatsi Tsayaneni, and Dagon Wadonti, which is, I think, what she was usually known as. So kind of an interesting and odd collection of names. These are portraits of her that are fictional. There are no contemporary portraits of this woman. But note the sort of rather odd iconography around her. We have the British flag here. We have what looks like sort of American Minutemen here. What's this? Who is this woman? What's she got to do with all of this? She has become, I will refer to her as Molly Brandt, a Mohawk woman, and she's become a sort of Canadian national heroine. And she's part of what Adams means when he talks about the black and white Johnsons. And the third image I just wanted to draw your attention to is one of the most famous European paintings of the 1760s. You might even say one of the most famous movies of the 1760s. This is almost the equivalent today of a spectacular movie. This is a huge painting by Benjamin West. West is the great portrait painter, genre painter, born in America, moves to London. He's a huge success, very, very famous figure in his own lifetime, particularly of historical painting and contemporary history. And this is painted in the mid-1760s in London, and it's put on display. And that's why I mean it's like a movie, right? So this is what you come to see, to get in your head one of the great moments of contemporary history, which is the British conquest of Canada. And this is, as you can see, almost a kind of secularized religious setup. It predates, there's a lot of paintings that will be kind of like this of, say, the death of Admiral Nelson. You know, this idea of the British military hero who has sacrificed his life and who is dying at the moment of victory. So this guy here is General James Wolfe. He has just at this moment stormed Quebec and taken Quebec, which is basically the fall of New France, really the pivotal moment in the completion of the conquest of North America by the British Empire. And Wolfe is therefore a great hero. He's mounted an extraordinary military operation of extraordinary daring, where Quebec is kind of protected on one side by cliffs that go down to the river, and he mounts a sort of night attack where his men climb up the cliffs and get in the undefended side of Quebec, and it's an extraordinary moment. It is indeed an amazing piece of intrepid military adventurism that's successful. So this painting is really famous at the time. You know, everybody who could get to see this in Britain would have paid their money to go and see it, from the royal family down to the prime minister, the cabinet, all the aristocracy. Anybody who had money, you pay to see this because it brings it home to you, this extraordinary moment. And what I want to point out to you, though, is, so this is Wolfe, recognizable. The figures around him are probably painted from life. These are real British officers who are now back in London. This is about 6-7 years after the event. So these are kind of figures who would be recognizable to the British ruling class at the time. But what I want to ask you to look at is this guy over here. So you have two figures here, right? who are really fascinating because they are not at the fall of Quebec. And actually, sometimes what's most interesting is what do you have to put in that is not historically true? One of the figures you have to put in is this Mohawk warrior. The expectation is that people in London paying their money want to see a romantic Indian who's like a kind of, almost oriental sort of figure of, contemplating the death with this sort of strange stoicism, half naked, lots of tattoos, lots of Indian dress, Indian headdress. But he's placed beside this guy, right, in the green coat, who's interesting. I'm sorry, this image is not that great over this side. You can't really see, but he's got Indian leggings. He's got a wampum belt, which is Indian, but he has a European green coat and a European sort of cap. So he's half Indian, half European. Right? That's how he's being presented. And unlike all the other figures who might be recognizable, he is, in a way, an invented figure. He's not there. But, and again, you can't quite see this, but on the powder horn, there's a powder horn hanging, and written on the powder horn to leave no doubt about who this guy is the words Sir William Johnson, Mohawk River, right? So why does he have to be identified? Because a contemporary audience wants to see him. They associate him very directly with the Indians. They associate him with this exotic, half Indian, half European figure, and they want to see him at the fall of Canada, right? He has to be at this historic moment, even though he was actually many miles away. He wasn't there. So let's take these three anomalies and try to unpack them a little bit and give ourselves some idea of who this character is, where he comes from, and in particular, what his Irish background is and what it means to this moment in history. So he is indeed a guy called William Johnson, born probably 1715. It's not certain. Definitely dies in 1774, so dies just on the cusp of the American Revolution. He comes from Warrenstown, which is just a small village just beyond Dunshaughlin, about 20 miles from Dublin. Right. It's a terrible thing for any historical researcher to have somebody called Johnson. It's the worst bloody name. There's so many Johnsons. But in his case, the Johnson is actually very interesting, right, because it's a recent translation of the family name. The family name is McShane, and it's just translated into John's son. And they are O'Neills. They're O'Neills of the Fuse, one of the big branches of the previously dominant O'Neill clan. And we'll come back to this, but he's very conscious of his O'Neill ancestry. This is really where he sees himself. So his father is an O'Neill. Obviously, they moved down into County Meath at some point. And they are, the most important thing about them is they're Jacobites, right? So this is what's relevant to this whole story. They are, so they're intermarried with what's sometimes kind of rather misleadingly called the Old English. Right? So the Old English are the descendants of settlers who came in with or in the wake of the Normans. So they've been settled in Ireland for a very, very long time. That, calling them English doesn't make a lot of sense. But they do have a distinctive kind of culture, ethnicity, and sense of their own history. And so, as you probably know, that whole area of County Meath is full of these Old English families. The Nugents, Tyrrells, which would come to Warrens, Plunketts, of course. Plunketts would have been one of the big families there. Dillons, there's a whole kind of nexus of Old English families who are substantial landowners. They're mostly very well-to-do, but they what marks them out is that they overwhelmingly remain Catholic. They're stubbornly Catholic, and they're stubbornly Jacobite. So they will have fought for the British monarchy during the Civil War against Cromwell, and then they will fight again for James II in the wars of the late 1680s, early 1690s. And as a result, they're largely dispossessed. So this is a story, I'm going to tell you, is a story of possession, of imperial possession, but it's a story of possession which is driven by a history of dispossession. And this is the first kind of complexity of Irishness in this context, right? So by the time William is born, so his father is Johnson McShane, Christopher Johnson. He's styling himself. His mother is a Warren, and the Warren family are they're a very well-connected Old English family there. It's kind of interesting that his mother marries his father because it's kind of marrying down, right? So the Old English did not tend to marry into sort of Gaelic stock, Christopher Johnson is a subtenant of the Warrens, who themselves are subtenants of the Earls of Fingal, who are the big landowners there. But Christopher Johnson marries into the Warrens, and this really is critical to the whole story. The Warrens are very, very active Jacobites. There's 3 or 4 brothers who are, captains or serious figures in the Jacobite army in Ireland. And as a result, they lose most of their lands. They still do retain some tenancies from the Earl of Fingal. So one of the things that's kind of interesting about County Meath, you think of it as so close to Dublin, and it is sort of anglicised in a lot of ways. So you think this must be very Protestant. But actually the Earls of Fingal remain Catholic. And there's a sort of protection for a sort of quiet Catholicism in that particular area. And the Warrens remain Catholic, as do the Johnsons. An interesting little insight into the failure, in a way, of the Church of Ireland in that area is Jonathan Swift is in his early career is a curate in Larracore in County Meath, and he famously claims subsequently that his sermons on Sunday as an Anglican priest would begin, "Dearly beloved Roger." Roger being his clerk. There's nobody there. And this is actually borne out. I looked at kind of parish records, Church of Ireland parish records, and the Church of Ireland, local Church of Ireland churches are very poor. They're very badly supported. So whatever money is still around is going into keeping Catholicism alive. Now, this is the period of the penal laws, remember? So it's a period when it's not in your interest to be Catholic. But what happens with a lot of these families is that they do the classic thing of dividing the sons. So, and this is, we'll come back to this, but if you've read Scottish fiction, 19th century Scottish fiction, it's one of the almost tropes of Scottish fiction is the story of how the family has to, sometimes they draw lots, One of the sons is going to join Bonnie Prince Charlie when Bonnie Prince Charlie invades, and the other son is going to remain loyal so that they have an each-way bet. And what happens with the Warrens is the each-way bet. So this area remains very Catholic, and not just Catholic, and this is relevant, I think, to the story about Johnson and the Mohawks and the Iroquois and Indian culture. It actually retains a very, very strong level of natural religion, or whatever we want to call it. So on the Johnson's land, the land that they rent, is a place called St. John's Well. It looks terrible now, but this was a major, major site of pilgrimage, Catholic pilgrimage. So much so that a special piece of legislation was passed by the Irish Protestant Parliament in 1710, saying, whereas 10,000 papists riotously assemble at a place commonly called St. John's Well under the pretense of worship, they are a great terror to Her Majesty's Protestant subjects, and so endanger the peace of her kingdom. The High Sheriff will suppress such insolent practices with a posse and apprehend the principal actors in the said riot and have them prosecuted with the utmost rigors of the law. So this is kind of actually dangerous Catholic territory. One of the things that's important in this story is that these families, these intermarried families, the Johnsons, the Warrens, will try to retain a Catholic identity in the place, in County Meath, while operating as Protestants, as good British Protestants internationally. That's the deal that's going to be made. And the critical figure in this is this guy, Peter Warren. The Warren family and the family of Johnson's mother have an extraordinary kind of example ahead of them, right, of how to recoup your lost status, your lost money, all the land that's you've been dispossessed of. There's a guy called Matthew Aylmer. The Aylmers are one of these Old English families. Aylmer would be Johnson's mother's uncle. And Aylmer is a fascinating figure in his own right, but Aylmer is one of the first to jump completely over to the Protestant side, to William of Orange. He joins the Navy, the Royal Navy. So the typical pathway for this class of people who are trying to recoup their social status and their money is to join the Catholic armies of Europe, of course, the Wild Geese, France, Spain, Austria, whatever. But Aylmer is one of the ones who realizes actually the Royal Navy is a very promising pathway to status and riches if you can succeed. One of the reasons is that, oddly enough, the Navy is more of a meritocracy than, say, the British Army would be. British Army is still very, very heavily dominated by social class. You have to buy your commission, you have to have a lot of money to buy it, and then very senior ranks are just going to be filled by aristocrats, almost regardless of merit. But you can't have upper class twits on your ships, right? You actually need people who know how to do the stuff. I mean, seamanship is, you have to learn and you have to be good at it. And so Aylmer joins the Royal Navy very early in the 1670s. He's there before the so-called Glorious Revolution, but he's one of the key figures in the British Navy who he writes to William of Orange saying, we're on your side. And he gets the reward. So he's a critical figure in easing the pathway of William of Orange into power. And so by the early 18th century, Aylmer, so this would be Johnson's granduncle, right, is Admiral of the Fleet, which means Commander-in-Chief of the entire British Navy. He's a very rich man. He's raised to the Irish peerage as Lord Aylmer of Balrath, all that stuff. So by the time he dies, he's a real figure of a success story, right? You can go from this very dubious sort of losing Jacobite cause, you can switch over and you can make an extraordinary career. And this guy follows in that path, right? So the Warrens are absolutely fascinating. There's a number of sons. They do this thing that they divide up. So two of the sons go into the Franciscans, There's a Franciscan friary in Multifarnham, and 2 of the sons go into the Royal Navy. And this guy is a spectacular success story who kind of follows in the Aylmer path. He's kind of worth a whole thing in his own right, but he is an extraordinary figure. You may not think you've ever heard of him, but if you've ever been on the tube in London and you stopped off at Warren Street, that's him. If you've ever been in Greenwich Village in New York at Warren Street, that's him. There's a Warren Street in Charleston, South Carolina. There's a Warren Street in Lewisburg. You know, I mean, he's a big, big figure. He's a big monument in Westminster Abbey. You know, he's all that stuff. He starts out as, you know, a sort of tenant of Earl of Fingal, that family. Anyway, he joins the Navy at, I think he was 12. It's hard for us to get our heads around what that must be like. Presumably he has some kind of protection from his uncle, you know, who's commander of the fleet after all, you know. But he rises very rapidly. He spends some years off the coast of North Africa fighting pirates. He goes to the Caribbean, fights pirates. And then he gets the big break, which is he is sent to New York, the burgeoning new port of New York. And this is, for a guy of his astuteness and ambition, is a huge opportunity. So Warren establishes himself in New York. It's a great posting because every time Britain is at war with France or Spain, he's raiding. He's now captain. He has his own ship. He's raiding Spanish and French shipping. At the time, the deal was extraordinarily good. During wartime, if you capture an enemy ship, the crown gets 1/3 of the goods you capture, the crew get 1/3, and the captain gets 1/3. So if you're raiding off the Caribbean, you know, Spanish silver ships, for example, you know, rum, sugar, you know, there's a lot of money. So he becomes very, very wealthy very quickly. By the time he's 25, he's established himself in New York. He's still a captain, he's still in the Navy, but he's smuggling. He marries into a big New York family called the Delanceys. They're kind of big property speculators. And he starts investing his prize money in land. He buys 300 acres of Manhattan Island. Right. The reason why there's a Warren Street in Greenwich Village is he founds Greenwich Village. He's the guy who sets up Greenwich Village. The other bit of land he has is 20 acres, I think it is, which is bounded by what's now West 21st Street in Manhattan. You know, so he's a pretty astute property speculator, property developer. Makes a lot of money, and he will, you know, go on as to be. He ends up as vice admiral of the fleet. He will go back to England eventually. Never really. Well, he does go back to Ireland sometimes, but mostly buys huge estate in Herefordshire. Becomes the MP for Westminster, which is the most prestigious seat in the House of Commons. You know, all that stuff. Big naval hero. Why is he important to us? Because he defrauds the Mohawks out of a big tract of land in the Mohawk Valley. Mohawk Valley is, so, you know, the Hudson goes up from New York. So if you know, that's the main artery going up north. And then the Mohawk River cuts west of the Hudson. And it's the main thoroughfare really going westward, right? If you want to get into what's still the largely unexplored west, then the Mohawk Valley is the sort of key pathway, really. And so Warren acquires through some dubious practices. He's not beyond dubious practices, but he acquires a huge tract of land in the Mohawk Valley. And he has previously, he's been home, he's visited, he's met his nephew, who's this William Johnson, his sister's son, who at this stage is about 22, 23. Warren has been using his fame and his money to buy back the land. in County Meath. This is the big driving force, get the land back. Interestingly, he will leave the land eventually to his Catholic brother, right? So, there's lots of interesting stuff going on here. Warren is supposed to, obviously to join the Navy, you have to be Protestant, right? And to be a Protestant, you're supposed to sign a roll of conversion if you're known to be Catholic. There's the formal document you have to sign. Very interesting, he doesn't sign that document until he's dying. It's more or less on his deathbed that he does it to ensure that his money is safe and that his legal situation is safe. So the Mohawk Valley, he has this land, but he doesn't know what to do with it except send his son or his nephew up there from County Meath. So he gets William Johnson, about 22, 23, sends him up, asks him to collect some families from County Meath and brings them right up to the Mohawk Valley, which is very, very unsettled. The people of the Mohawk Valley are the Mohawks. The Mohawks are part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. French call it Iroquois or Iroquois. There's originally 5 nations: the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, and the Senecas. They're joined by the Tuscaroras in the early 18th century to form the 6 nations. So this is, this is New York. This is, so you're looking, that's the Hudson, the Mohawk River. The Mohawks are the closest to European settlement. Then you have the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Senecas, the Cayugas. And they've worked out an extraordinarily sophisticated political system, right? It may well have influenced Benjamin Franklin, who witnessed this in operation. They had long histories of internecine warfare. The prophet comes along, convinces the great war chief Hiawatha, you probably heard of, that they have to stop killing each other. And the way to do this is to form this very sophisticated political confederacy. And it is very sophisticated. So the system is that the 2 eastern nations, the Mohawks and the Oneidas, can propose things. The 2 western nations, the Senecas and the Cayugas, can debate them and more or less decide. And the Onondagas in the middle hold the neutral territory. So the council fire is lit in Onondaga, and this system works. And it's to keep the Confederacy together is their main goal in life. They have been, of course, decimated, particularly the Mohawks, right? So by the time Johnson gets up there in about, the sort of late 1730s, they've lost vast numbers of people to disease. Western diseases, of course, are catastrophic for indigenous peoples. They've lost them to warfare, first against the Dutch, then against the British. And then they've lost population very traumatically. The Jesuits have converted significant numbers of Mohawks to Catholicism, and the Catholic Mohawks moved to Canada. So the Mohawk nation itself is kind of divided. But they're still very important because they are the closest to the British Empire. And they have this role in the Confederacy where they're very important in proposing actions to the rest of the Confederacy. They're called the elder brothers of so that's where they are. Now, Mohawk agency in the story is really important to understand, right? So, as I said, these are very sophisticated people. They've been dealing with Europeans for a long, long time, for generations. This is a painting. This guy is really important in the story. He's called, this is probably a corruption of his real name, but it's Tiinin Hogaro. He's known in English as Hendrik, a Dutch name, so obviously they dealt with Dutch first. This is a painting made of him in London in 1710, right? So he's been to London to see the Queen, literally. there's a Mohawk delegation is taken over to London in 1710. They meet the Queen. They see a production of Macbeth. And he seems to be the youngest of them, but he's regarded as the most senior. So he's obviously the most influential figure. And so he becomes the sort of mediator, really, between his people and the British. And that's him in later life. He often adopts a kind of semi-British dress, military dress. He would have had Indian leggings, and so he himself is kind of adopting this half and half sort of world. Johnson moves up with some of these families from County Meath, and he starts clearing land. And very quickly, Hendrik realizes we can use this guy. We need a mediator who's English, who knows that world well enough that I can work with them. And he basically adopts Johnson as his almost like surrogate son. And quite quickly, Johnson is inducted into the Mohawk Nation. So he becomes a Mohawk chieftain. He's given this name Warrigiahe, which he said it means a man who undertakes great things. This becomes a very famous name, and it sounds like they're kind of identifying him as a world historical figure. I think they just mean he's working very hard, clearing land, and he's busy. Now, it should be said, it's very important, it's part of the story that will get kind of lost, but yes, he is very busy, and him and the Irish people are doing a lot of work. Most of the work's being done by African slaves. Peter Warren sends about 30 African slaves up to help clear this land. And it's worth remembering, in case we romanticize this guy too much, that he is a slaveholder for all of his life and shows no great compunction. So he will be hugely sympathetic to the Indians, to their culture, to their humanity, but shows no similar evidence at all of any kind of consciousness of the humanity of black slaves. I was researching him, and I didn't really know about this. And I was looking at his accounts, and suddenly I just came across a line which said "Negroes handcuffs," 5 shillings. In his accounts, Negroes handcuffs. So this is a very violent process, of course, as slavery always is. But what happens is he's adopted into the Mohawks, and this allows him to acquire power. Right? These are important people for the British, and he sets up his own operation. Right, so he begins to. He's sent there as a farmer to kind of clear land for his uncle, but he moves into his own space. He acquires land from the Mohawks, and he becomes a trader. And he gets pretty prosperous as a trader because what he's able to do through Mohawk influences. So the trade overwhelmingly is the fur trade. So that's what the Iroquois people have to barter and sell to Europeans. I just came across, it struck me a kind of small example of just how universal in Europe of this time furs as status symbols are. Queen Archulira, he has a beaver hat, Having a beaver hat is like a real, he's a gent, So the furs come overwhelmingly from North America. They're overwhelmingly hunted and caught by indigenous peoples, and then they're sold. They're sold for pretty much everything, right? One of the great fascinations of particularly the Eastern Iroquois people is that they're not figures of the past. They're figures of the future. They're the first pure consumers on the planet. They make nothing anymore. They don't know how to make bows and arrows. They don't use them. They don't know how to make, wooden implements, and they don't really make their own clothes, and they don't, they have to get everything because, you know, that a few generations before people decided, actually, it's much more convenient to have a nice iron pot rather than a wooden one. It's, you know, English woolen manufacturers are pretty good because you can wash them out and you can dry them and you can, you know, all this stuff. But particularly, they're sort of sucked in order to get the goods, they have to keep killing animals for the furs. In order to kill the animals, you have to have guns. You have to have gunpowder. They don't make guns. They don't manufacture gunpowder. They don't know how to repair guns. They don't have the facilities to do this. They don't have blacksmiths. You know, so they're very dependent on this trade. And they're exploited. Alcohol becomes a big vector of exploitation, where very often, you know, Iroquois men who come into trading posts sell their furs, are given money, and then they're kind of induced to buy rum with the money, and then they wake up and everything is gone. You know, so there's a whole history of cheating and exploitation going on. Johnson is smart. Johnson realizes, perhaps under the guidance of Hendrick, he realizes deal fairly with people. You know. So he establishes himself as the fair trader. And he becomes a sort of real example, again, of something else about multiculturalism, but globalization, economic globalization, right? So this guy is buying furs from, and a lot of these are coming through chains of trade, really from the far west, you know, places where Europeans have never been, and from the far north. And he's selling everything, you know. One of the things I found most fascinating in looking at his accounts is that he's selling Chinese vermilion to Iroquois warriors for their war paint. Right? He's selling mirrors. He sells huge numbers of mirrors, you know, for putting on war paint, you know. So it's a very globalized kind of trade. So he's establishing himself in this way as this trusted figure. He's going to eventually sort of become a sort of, you know, so he's a Mohawk, he's Waragahe. He also builds this house, which is still there. This is Johnson Hall up in the Mohawk Valley, which is sort of trying to be like a kind of, you know, Irish gentleman's Georgian residence, you know. So it's this kind of strange world. That's an impression, our impression of what it would have been like at the time. So this is a bit later when he's become the kind of key figure mediating between the Indians and the British. The fire is lit. So the ritual fire was in Onondaga. Johnson persuades them to have a second ritual fire at his house. Right? So it becomes this kind of great ritual center. Now, actually, I'm going to skip over this just for time reasons, but this is a letter that was sent to him from a guy in County Meath who's looking for a job as Johnson has established himself. And he sends regards. He writes a letter in Latin, which presuming that Johnson probably can read Latin. He offers to bring all his instruments, including his bagpipes, which is interesting. Presumably uilleann pipes. This is a very early reference then to uilleann pipes. We don't have a lot of them. But this is what I love. The second PS in it is Bannocht lat go vecca me hu. Right? Spelt phonetically. Now, so far as I know, this phonetic spelling was developed in Protestant schools for Catholic convert kids. You know, and it's sort of teaching Protestant ministers, presumably as well, also how to speak Irish. So it's possible that this guy who's writing to him knows that maybe Johnson was at one of these schools. But there's certainly a use of Irish as well, still going on here at some, and it's almost a code, you know. So Johnson then gradually builds this extraordinary multicultural world. He is sexually prodigious. The folklore in the Mohawk Valley is that he had about 100 children. It's probably a slight exaggeration, but he could well have had a dozen or 20 by a lot of different mothers. He's freed from Catholic Ireland. You know, he's having a great time. He's a young man. He's doing very well. His first consort is a Palatine German girl who's 16, whom he meets up there, and she becomes his consort and what's called his housekeeper. Housekeeper sounds a bit dismissive, but actually the housekeeper is the one in charge of the whole domestic operation, which is a big thing. She's called Catherine Weissenberg, and he has a son and 2 daughters with her. So he has 3 quote unquote white children. She dies young, and his new consort is, as we saw, the woman from the stamps, Molly Brandt, daughter of a Mohawk sachem, and she becomes a very important figure in her own right. So Molly replaces Catherine as the housekeeper of this operation. And she's a very, very influential figure in Mohawk society and in Iroquois society in general. And then they proceed to have a clatter of children. Right? So, and he acknowledges these children in his will. There's 6 children, Mohawk children, that he acknowledges as his. Right? There are probably others, and we know at least of 2 that he also acknowledges. So there are other kids. But it's really important to remember that he has this dual family identity by now, right? So he has European children and he has Mohawk children, and they're all living in the same house. So gradually what builds up is this, when I talk about multiculturalism, the languages spoken in this house would be English. I would suspect some Irish, because there are a lot of tenants who've been brought over from Ireland. There is Mohawk and the other Iroquois languages. Other Indian languages would come in as people come to visit. German, certainly, because Catherine Weissenberg was Palatine and her mother still lives in the house. You know, it's a multilingual world in the 1730s, 1740s, 1750s. You know, what Molly's younger brother, Joseph Brandt, is a major figure. He becomes a critical figure in North American history and Canadian history. Just a spoiler alert, he will end up founding the Orange Order in Kingston in Canada. That's Joseph Brandt, extraordinary looking man. Anyway, so all of this is going very well. He has his trading world. He's cutting out the Dutch traders in Albany because he's much further west. He's becoming this kind of very, very potent figure. Big thing then happens, which is the outbreak of war, the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740s. And then this really continues into what's called the 7 Years' War in the 1750s. Johnson becomes a military figure. He's not military, he's no training, no intention of ever being a soldier, but by force of circumstance, he's on the frontier really between New France and New England, as it's still called. They call the whole thing New England, but it's New York. And as the wars break out between the 2 empires, the French start raiding down into his terrain with their Indian allies. There's a lot of killing going on. And then Johnson in the mid-1740s runs what we could only call a terrorist war. Right? So this is a war of atrocity and counter-atrocity. There's no real military purpose in this in the 1740s. Again, just to make clear, we're not romanticizing this guy. You know, he would see these as reprisals, and I suppose they are, but the reprisals carried out against women and children and unarmed people. They raid into settlements in Canada. There's no doubt that Johnson knows that this includes murdering children, because he operates a system of bounties for his Indian warrior allies, where it's £10 for a scalp. If you bring back a scalp, you get £10, and you get £5 for the scalp of a child. Right? So, you know, this is extreme violence, that's breaking out on this frontier. But there is, by the 1750s, when the 7 Years' War is broken out, there is more formal warfare. And Johnson gets inducted into this. He's been appointed in the 1740s, late 1740s, as what the British call Colonel of the Six Nations. So he's the leader of the Iroquois who fight with the British. Right? That's what he's seen like. In this guise, he would dress as a war chief, Iroquois war chief. He would do the war dances. He will sing the war songs. That's the way he operates. But then there's more formal warfare, and they want him to bring his Mohawk warriors into the war against the French, which is more formalized. And this leads to a kind of pivotal event in his career, which is the Battle of Lake George. Lake George is called Lake George if you're ever up in the Adirondacks, or it's a huge tourist spot now. It's one of the most kind of desirable places in North America. People go there all the time. Very beautiful. It's called Lake George because Johnson called it Lake George. It was Lac Saint-Sacrement. But there's a French army coming down from Canada. Obviously, a lot of the travel is through the lakes. Johnson goes up to try to intercept them at the foot of the lake. And there's a very bloody, inconclusive sort of a battle, three-part battle that happens, called the Battle of Lake George. It's a very pivotal moment because it is the first time in American history that an entirely American army defeats a regular European army. Right? The American patriots of the War of Independence will congratulate themselves on being the first to do this, but Johnson does it. So his troops are a mix of colonial militia and Iroquois warriors. And they fight this battle. Hendrick, his substitute Mohawk father, gets killed. It's quite bloody. But the British are having a terrible time in this war. They're losing most of it, and they need a victory. So although this is actually sort of inconclusive, both sides end up withdrawing. The French withdraw back into Canada. Johnson's mauled, and he has to withdraw back down into New York. But he is made Sir William Johnson. First Baronet of New York, that's his title. Hereditary baronetcy, which still exists, by the way. I talked to a guy who's now the 8th Baronet of New York. I said to him, do you use the title? He said, no. People just think it's like you're saying you're the king of Albania or something. Just nobody believes it still exists, but it does. He is given... So what he's always wanted is he's mediating, as I said, between the Indians and the British. He's always hated having the interference, as he sees it, of the colonial assembly in New York, the governors of New York. He wants to deal with this on his own. He says, I know how to do this. I know these people. I speak their language. I know their rituals. I am one of their leaders. I can do this. And he's always frustrated by the fact that they're interfering with him as he sees it. So as a result of the prestige of this battle, he gets what he always wanted, which is a royal appointment. So he's now answerable, in theory, only to the king in London, basically to the Board of Trade in London, but he's Sir William Johnson, and his title now is Sole Superintendent of Indian Affairs. Right? Sole Superintendent, that's the key thing. So it's now a personal power base that he has, right? Another painting, again, Benjamin West. So Johnson he's never been in London, right? He went straight from County Meath, presumably to Dublin, goes to New York. That's his life. He's never been in England. So he has to project his power now through visual imagery. And this is, I suspect this was commissioned by Johnson and his family from West in London. And this is Johnson here. This time he's shown as a sort of English military officer. He is a general, by the way, now he's General Johnson. You've got these English soldiers. You've got the Indian figure. But this time, the Indian is not sort of passive and serene. He's about to try to kill this guy. This guy is the French commander, who's called Jean-Armand Dieskau. He was actually German, but this guy's a serious French commander. Many of you will have heard the Battle of Fontenoy, kind of famous in Irish history. He leads the cavalry for the French at the Battle of Fontenoy. He's a hardened professional soldier. Johnson wins the battle, not because he really wins the battle, but because he captures Dieskau. He captures the enemy commander, who is famous, right? Famous warrior, famous soldier. So he prevents, so in Iroquois culture, they're entitled to scalp and take the prisoner, right? Johnson prevents them from killing Dieskau. And I think he does this out of basic humanity, but it's a great bit of propaganda, right, as well. So you can see in this image, this is our European guy in North America who can tame the savagery of the indigenous people. You know, the indigenous people are noble and beautiful, and we kind of like them, and they're great allies, but they need to be controlled. Right? And here you have this image of, you know, our guy literally sort of holding off the tomahawk of the warrior. This is so famous. This is so Dieskau ends up back in Paris, and he makes the acquaintance of one of the key figures of the Enlightenment, Denis Diderot, co-creator of the encyclopedia, you know, Diderot writes, this is a letter from Diderot, 1760, describing what happened. You know, I won't, for time reasons, I won't go through it, but it ends up him saying, so it actually feeds very much into the Enlightenment idea of the basic goodness of humanity, right, which is kind of key. He says, so he describes Johnson and what he does and how amazing it is, and he says, "Oh, dear friend, nature did not make us wicked. It is bad education, bad example, bad legislation that corrupt us. If this is an error, at least I'm glad to find it deep in my heart." And he says the generous actions of the English general, Johnson is English, contributed to this belief, right? So Johnson's actually finding a kind of way into Enlightenment thinking. So what he does, I'm going to move along quickly here, but what he's able to do then is to create this Indian superintendency as a little Irish empire. Right? So even though Diderot thinks he's English, even though he's now, you know, Sir William Johnson, he basically creates a whole power base, which is Irish and Iroquois, and is also familial. So his blended family, his mixed Mohawk Indian family, and Irish family comes into it. So the people who are under him in this superintendency are his son, John Johnson, his nephew, Guy Johnson, who he brings over from County Meath. This is also by Benjamin West. Daniel Klaus, who has the misfortune not to be Irish, but is German, but he's okay because he's married to Johnson's daughter, so that's okay. And a guy called George Croghan, who deserves a very long lecture in his own right, extraordinary figure, probably born in Dublin, contemporary of William Johnson's, very early settler trader in Western Pennsylvania, Ohio. He's one of the first Europeans, actually, who deals in all that part of the world. And he's married to Joseph Brant. Remember Joseph Brant, we saw earlier, Molly's brother. So this is a sort of Irish Indian family business, right? And it's basically there to mediate all relations between the empire and the indigenous peoples. Johnson's ultimate aim is to draw a line across the American continent beyond which white people will never go. So what he wants to do is certainly grab a lot of land. He's grabbed a lot of land for himself and his friends and George Croghan, they all have land, but he wants to preserve the independence and sovereignty of the Indian nations. Right? partly because he actually, he's intermarried with them, he has Indian children, this is part of his life now, but also partly because it's his power base. If they're not independent people, you don't need this mediation. He regards himself as a diplomat representing the empire to independent peoples. And he actually manages in 1768 to get the empire to draw a line. The Treaty of Fort Stanwix draws a line which is really, we look at the map now, it's very, very far east. It leaves most of America to the indigenous population. It's a kind of an Irish dream that never really, of course, takes hold because, oddly enough, partly because of other Irish people. This is also the period when you've got the huge migration from Ulster, the Ulster Scots moving in, and they're not going to obey any line of settlement. They're going to cross these lines into Pennsylvania, into Ohio. Johnson hates Ulster Presbyterians for exactly this reason. He sees them as crude and ignorant and unsympathetic to the Indians. So they murder Indians. They don't, they provoke Indians. He's very against them. What happens then? So this world disappears. So it's an extraordinary, vibrant creation, and it's obliterated by the American Revolution. So Johnson dies just on the cusp of the Revolution. John Johnson is his heir. Guy Johnson succeeds him as sole superintendent of Indian Affairs. Molly is a very, very influential figure. They all take the British side because they're royalists, because their whole wealth, power, recuperation of their social status is all to do with this relationship to the king. And they're driven out, they go into Canada, they stage very violent raids back into the very terrain that they themselves occupied. So there are kind of notorious massacres carried out by led by Joseph Brant and by John Johnson. So this is where we started with Adams saying, these rascals must be exterminated. The Johnson family, black and white, have to be exterminated. I'm not going to go into this, but Johnson disappears in a way from American history because he doesn't fit. He's a loyalist, or his family are loyalists, Tories, as they would call them. But he comes out in literature, so he's a huge figure in the Leatherstocking novels, Fenimore Cooper, which are all set, of course, in Johnson terrain. It's all in the forests of upstate New York. Leatherstocking keeps talking about when I was out with Sir William. He's a sort of, he learned everything from Sir William. And of course, he is the white Indian. It's that figure of the white Indian, which becomes very important. I'll move on. And then the last kind of big cultural presence is in a very strange novel by Robert Louis Stevenson, writer of those Jekyll and Hyde, Treasure Island, called The Master of Ballantrae. And what's fascinating about it is that it's a Jacobite novel, or it's about the same story. The Jacobite family who split between the one who stays Protestant and good and with the Hanoverians and one who goes off to fight for Bonnie Prince Charlie. And it's very strange because it's a Scottish story. And Stevenson decides, for reasons I can't, well, he was visiting upstate New York, so he must have picked up all the stuff about Johnson, but he decides to make Johnson a major character towards the end of the novel. So the denouement of the novel is this sort of grotesque death of these two brothers. It's kind of supernatural, haunted, gothic sort of thing. And the witness who sees them die is William Johnson. He has to be there somehow to finish this strange story of the doubleness of what happened with Jacobitism, with Catholicism, with Protestantism, with all of this in America. The Mohawks are destroyed. The Iroquois Confederacy is largely destroyed. The Haudenosaunee people have some reservations in upstate New York now, but they're mostly in Canada. One just note to finish on, slightly haunting note. Johnson exerted influence largely because he became the master of Iroquois ritual. He taught himself in great detail all the really important rituals, the dances, the ceremonies, the ways of conducting ritual business. A lot of those rituals were lost in the disruption. But in about 1880, an anthropologist, an early anthropologist, was interviewing a guy, an Iroquois chief in Canada, who he was asking him about rituals, and the guy said, well, actually, I know what the rituals are because I have this copybook. And he took out a copybook, which was a copy made by one of Johnson's Mohawk grandchildren of Johnson's book in which he had written down all the rituals. And today, the rituals that the Iroquois people use are based on that text. Right? So it's a strange kind of survival amidst this otherwise pretty terrible story of annihilation. Adams's prediction about extermination wasn't quite true, but it wasn't entirely far off the truth either. Thank you very much.